The silence after seemed incredibly loud. Magla gaped at her in astonishment, then gave a start at realizing that she was standing halfway to the blue benches. Hastily unloosing her fists, she paused to snatch up her shawl and hurried back to her own seat. Shiriam stood weeping openly. Surely it had not been that loud. A proposal has been laid before the hall, Egwene repeated into the silence. After that power-magnified glare, her voice rang in her own ears. Perhaps it had been louder than she thought. That weave had never been intended for use inside walls, even patched canvas walls. How speak you in support of an alliance with the Black Tower, Moria? She sat down as soon as she finished. How did she stand on this? What difficulties would it present her? How could it be used to advantage? It might help her indeed. Those were the first two things to come to mind. She wished Shiriam would dry her eyes and straighten her backbone. She was the Amelin seat, and she needed a keeper, not a milksop. It took a few minutes for order to restore itself. Sitters straightening clothes and smoothing skirts unnecessarily, avoiding each other's eyes and especially not looking at the watching sisters crowded behind the benches. Some sitters' faces became stained with red that had nothing to do with anger. Sitters did not shriek at one another like farmhands at shearing, most especially not in front of other sisters. We do be faced with two seemingly insurmountable difficulties, Moria said finally. Her voice was composed and cool once more, but a hint of flush still hung in her cheeks. The Forsaken have discovered a weapon, discovered or uncovered. They surely would have used it before now had they possessed it. A weapon we can no counter, a weapon we can no match, though the light do know why we would wish to, but most importantly, a weapon we can neither survive nor stop. At the same time, the shaman have grown like weeds. Reliable reports do put their numbers at nearly equal to all the Aes Sedai living. Even if that number do be inflated, we can no afford to believe it exaggerated far, and more men come every day. The Eisendeers do be too consistent to believe anything else. We should take these men and gentle them, of course, but we have ignored them because of the dragon reborn. We have put them off to be dealt with later. The bitter truth do be that it be too late to try taking them. They do be too many. Maybe it did be too late when we did first learn what they were doing. If we can no gentle these men, then we must control them somehow. An agreement with the Black Tower. Alliance be too strong a word. With a carefully worded agreement, we can take the first steps toward protecting the world from them. We also can bring them into our circles. Raising a cautionary finger, Moria ran her gaze along the benches, but her voice remained cool and composed and firm. We must make it clear that a sister will always meld the flows. I do not suggest letting man control a linked circle, but with men in the circles we can expand them. With the blessings of the light, perhaps we can expand the circles far enough to counter this weapon of the Forsaken. We do kill two hares with one stone, but these hares do be lions, and if we do no cast that stone, one of them will surely kill us. It is as simple as that. Silence fell, excepting Shiriam at least. Standing hunched in on herself a few feet from Egwene, shoulders shaking, she still had not mastered her weeping. Then Ramonda sighed heavily. Perhaps we can expand the circles enough to counter the Forsaken, she said in a quiet voice, in a way that gave her words more weight than if she had shouted.
Hey, Fire, how you doing?
Perhaps we can control the Ashaman. A thin word, perhaps, in either context. When you do be drowning, Moria replied, equally quiet. You do grab at whatever branch floats by, even when you can no be sure it will support your weight until you have hold. The water has no closed over our heads yet, Ramonda, but we be drowning. We do be drowning. Again there was silence, but for Shiriam's sniveling. Had she forgotten all self-control? But then no one among the sitters wore a pleasant expression, not even Moria or Malind or Esmeralda. It was not a pleasant prospect that lay in front of them. Delana's face had turned decidedly greenish. She looked as if she might be the one to sick up, rather than Shiriam. Egwene stood once more, long enough to ask the required question. Even when the unthinkable was proposed, the rituals must be followed, perhaps more so then than ever. Who speaks against this proposal? There was no shortage of speakers there, though everyone had regained herself enough for them to follow protocol. Several sitters moved at once, but Magla was first on her feet, and the others sat back with no outward displays of impatience. Faisella followed Magla, and Barrelin followed Faisella. Then came Soroya, and finally Takima. Each spoke at length, Barrelin and Soroya coming very near making the forbidden speeches, and each spoke with all the eloquence she could summon. No one reached the sitter's chair lacking eloquence at need. Even so, it soon became clear that they were repeating themselves and each other, just in different words. The Forsaken and their weapon were never mentioned. The Black Tower was the sitter's topic, the Black Tower and the Ashaman. The Black Tower was a blight on the face of the earth, as great a threat to the world as the last battle itself. The very name suggested connections to the shadow, not to mention being a direct slap at the White Tower. The so-called Ashaman, no one used the name without adding so-called or saying it with a sneer. Guardians it meant in the old tongue, and they were anything but guardians. The so-called Ashaman were men who could channel, men doomed to go insane if the male half of the power did not kill them first. Madmen wielding the one power. From Magla to Takima, every one of them invested that with every scrap of horror in them. 3,000 years of the world's horror, and the breaking of the world before that. Men like this had destroyed the world, destroyed the age of legends, and changed the face of the world to desolation. This was who they were being asked to make alliance with. If they did so, they would be anathema in every nation, and rightly. They would be scorned by every Aes Sedai, and rightly. It could not be. It could not. When Takima finally sat, arranging her shawl carefully along her arms, she wore a small but quite satisfied smile. Together they had managed to make the Ashaman seem more fearsome, more dangerous than the Forsaken and the last battle combined, maybe even a match for the Dark One himself. Since Egwene had begun the ritual questions, it was for her
You just
to
gotta
finish,
roll one up,
and
and
she rose long enough to say,
we'll do a
"Who
dabber
stands
cheer.
for an agreement with the Black Tower?" She had only thought there was silence in the pavilion before. Shiriam had finally governed her weeping, though tears glistened on her cheeks still, but her gulp sounded like shouts in the quiet that followed that question. Takima's smile slid sideways when Janya stood as soon as the question left Egwene's mouth. "Even a slim branch is
Hey,
better than no
Christopher,
branch
how
when
you
you're
doing?
dry," Janya
Good
said.
to see you.
"I'd rather try than trust to hope until I go under." She had the habit of speaking when she was not supposed to. Samalin rose to stand beside Malind, and suddenly there was a rush. Salita and Barana and Aledrin together, with Quamesa only a tick behind. 9 sitters on their feet, and there it hung as the moments stretched out. Egwene realized she was biting her lip and stopped hurriedly, hoping no one had noticed. She could still feel the impression of her teeth. She hoped she had not drawn blood. Not that anyone was looking at her. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath. Romanda sat frowning up at Salita, who was staring straight ahead, her face gray and her lips trembling. The Tyrant's Senatrice, content de te voir. The Tyrant's sister might not be able to hide her fear, but she was going ahead. Romanda nodded slowly and then, shockingly, stood. She, too, decided to violate custom. "Sometimes," she said, looking straight at Lelaine, "we must do things we would rather not." Lelaine met the gray-haired yellow's eyes without blinking. Her face might have been cast in porcelain. Her chin rose by slow increments, and suddenly she stood, glancing down impatiently at Lorella, who gaped at her a moment before coming to her feet. Everyone stared. No one made a sound. It was done. Almost done, anyway. Egwene cleared her throat, trying to catch Shiriam's attention. The next part was the keepers, but Shiriam stood, scrubbing the tears from her cheeks with her fingers and running her eyes along the benches as if counting how many sitters were standing and hoping to find she had miscounted. Egwene cleared her throat more loudly, and the green-eyed woman gave a start and turned to stare at her. Even then, it seemed to take forever before she recalled herself to her duty. "The lesser consensus standing," she announced in an unsteady voice. "An agreement will be sought with the Black Tower." Inhaling deeply, she straightened to her full height, and her voice gained strength. She was back onto familiar ground. "In the interest of unity, I ask for the greater consensus to stand." That was a powerful call. Even on matters that could be decided by the lesser consensus, unanimity was always preferred, always strived for.
It kind of sucks
Hours of discussion, days might go into reaching it, but the effort would not stop until every sitter agreed, or it was clear as well water that there could be no agreement. A powerful call, one that tugged at every sister. Delana rose like a puppet drawn up against her will, looking around uncertainly. "I cannot stand for this," Takima said, against all decorum. "No matter what anyone says, no matter how long we sit, I cannot and I will not. I will not." No one else stood either. Oh, Faisella shifted on her bench, half moved as if to stand, adjusted her shawl, twitched again as if she might stand. That was as close as anyone came. Soroya was biting her knuckle with an expression of horror, and Varolin wore the look of a woman who had been hit between the eyes with a hammer. Magla gripped the ends of her bench, holding herself in place and staring bleakly at the carpets in front of her. Plainly she was aware of the scowl Ramonda was aiming at the back of her neck, but her only response was to hunch her shoulders. Takima should have been the end of it. There was no point in seeking the greater consensus when someone made it plain she would not stand. But Egwene decided to make her own break with decorum and protocol. "Is there anyone who feels she must leave her chair over this?" she asked in a loud, clear voice. Gasps filled the pavilion, but she was holding her breath. This could shatter them, but better to have it out in the open now if that was what was to come of it. Soroya looked at her wildly, but no one moved. "Then we will go forward," she said. "Carefully. It will take time to plan exactly who is to approach the Black Tower and what they are to say. Time for her to plant a few safeguards, it was to be hoped. Right, she was going to have to scramble to deal with this. First, are there suggestions for our embassy?" Chapter 20. In the Night. Long before the sitting ended, in spite of the cloak folded beneath her, Egwene's bottom was quite numb from the hard wooden bench. After listening to endless discussion, she wished her ears were numb as well. Shiriam, forced to stand, had begun shifting her feet as if wishing for a chair, or maybe just to sit down on the carpets. Egwene could have left, freeing herself and Shiriam. Nothing required the Amelin to stay, and at best her comments were listened to politely, after which the hall galloped off in its own direction. This had nothing to do with the war, and with the bit between their teeth, the hall was not about to let her get a hand on the reins. She could have walked out at any time, with a slight interruption in the discussions for the required ceremonies, but if she did, she feared that first thing in the morning she might be handed a fully fledged plan, one the sitters were already carrying out, and her with no idea what was coming until she read it. At least, that was her fear in the beginning. Who spoke at the greatest length was no surprise, not any longer. Magla and Soroya, Takima and Faisella and Varolin each fretting visibly when another sitter had the floor. Oh, they accepted the decision of the hall, at least on the surface. There was nothing else for them to do except resign their chairs. However hard the hall might be willing to struggle for consensus if need be, once a course of action was decided by whatever consensus, then everyone was expected to follow, or at the very least, not hinder. That was the rub. What exactly constituted hindrance? None of the five spoke against a sitter from her own
Hey,
agile
Sasquatch, how you
group, but the
doing?
other four leaped to their feet when any sitter took
Hope
her
you're
bench
doing
again,
good.
and all five if the sitter was blue. And whoever got the floor spoke very persuasively as to why the previous speaker's suggestions were utterly wrong and perhaps a recipe for disaster. Not that there was any real sign of collusion that Egwene could see. They eyed each other as warily as they did anyone else, frowned at each other as hard, if not harder, and, plainly, trusted none of the others to make her arguments. In any event, little of what was suggested came close to conformity. The sitters disagreed on how many sisters should be sent to the Black Tower, and how many
How you
from
been
each
doing,
Ajah,
Sasquatch?
on when those sisters were to be sent, what they must demand, what they should be allowed to agree to, and what ordered to refuse entirely. In a matter this delicate, any error could lead to disaster, on top of which every Ajah except the Yellow considered itself uniquely qualified to provide the leadership of the mission, from Kwamesa's insistence that the goal was negotiating a treaty of sorts, to Esmeralda's claim that historical knowledge was a necessity for such an unprecedented undertaking. Varana even pointed out that an agreement of this nature must be reached by absolute rationality. Dealing with the Ashaman was sure to inflame passions, and anything except cold logic would surely lead to disaster on the spot. She grew rather heated about it, in fact.
Good shit.
Romanda
Hell
did
yeah.
want the party led by a Yellow, yet since it hardly seemed there would be any great need for healing, she was reduced to a stubborn insistence that anyone else might be swayed by her Ajah's special interests and forget the point of what they were doing. Sitters of the same Ajah supported one another only to the extent of not openly opposing, and no two Ajahs were willing to stand together on much beyond the fact that they had agreed to send an embassy to the Black Tower. Whether it should be called an embassy remained in dispute, even by some who had stood in its favor at the start. Moria herself seemed taken aback by the very idea. Egwene was not the only one who found the constant argument and counter-argument wearing, the points chopped so fine that nothing remained and everything had to begin over. Sisters drifted away from behind the benches. Others replaced them and then drifted away in turn after a few hours. By the time Shiriam uttered the ritual, "Depart now in the light," night had descended, and only a few dozen remained besides Egwene and the sitters, several of whom sagged as though they had been run through a mangle like damp bed linens. And nothing at all had been decided except that more talk was necessary before anything could be decided. Outside, a pale half-moon hung in a velvet black sky, dusted with glittering stars, and the air was bitter cold. Her breath curling a pale mist in the darkness, Egwene walked away from the hall, smiling as she listened to the sitters scattering behind her, some still arguing. Romanda and Lelaine were walking together, but the Yellow's clear, high voice rose perilously close to shouting, and the Blue's was not far behind. They usually argued when forced into one another's company, but this was the first time Egwene had seen them choose it when they did not have to. Shiriam half-heartedly offered to fetch the reports on wagon repairs and fodder that she had asked for that morning, but the weary-eyed woman did not attempt to hide her relief when Egwene sent her off to her bed. With a hurried curtsy, she went scurrying away into the night, clutching her cloak around her. Most of the tents stood dark, shadows in the moonlight. Few sisters remained awake long after nightfall. Lamp oil and candles were never in generous supply. For the moment, delay suited Egwene perfectly, but that was not the only reason for her smile. Somewhere in all that argument, her headache had gone away entirely. She would have no difficulty at all going to sleep this night. Halima always remedied that. Yet her dreams were always troubled after one of Halima's massages. Well, few of her dreams were light, but these were darker than any others, and strangely she could never remember anything except that they were dark and troubled. Doubtless both things came from some remnant of the pains that Halima's fingers would not reach, yet the last was disturbing in itself. She had learned to remember every dream. She had to remember every dream. Still, with no headache tonight, she should have no problems, and dreaming was the least of what she had to do. Like the hall and her study, her tent stood in a little clearing with its own strip of wooden walkway, the nearest tents a dozen spans off, to give the Amelin a bit of privacy. At least, that was how the spacing was explained. It might even have been the truth now. Egwene Alvir was certainly not irrelevant anymore. The tent was not large, short of 4 paces on a side, and crowded inside with 4 brass-bound chests full of clothing stacked against one wall, 2 cots and a tiny round table, a bronze brazier, a washstand, a stand mirror, and one of the few real chairs in the camp. A simple piece with a little plain carving. It took up entirely too much room, but it was comfortable, and a great luxury when she wanted to curl her feet beneath her and read, when she had time to read anything for pleasure. The second cot was Halima's, and she was surprised to see the woman was not already there, waiting on her. The tent was not unoccupied, however. "You had nothing but bread for breakfast, Mother," Chesa said in a mildly accusing voice as Egwene ducked through the entry flaps. Not far from stout in her plain gray dress, Egwene's maid was sitting on the tent's stool, darning stockings by the light of an oil lamp. She was a pretty woman without a touch of gray in her hair, yet sometimes it seemed that Chesa had been in her employ forever, rather than just since Salvador. She certainly took all the liberties of an old servant, including the right to scold. "You ate nothing at all midday, as far as I can learn," she went on, holding up a snowy silk stocking to study the patch she was making in the field. "And your dinner's gone cold there on the table, an hour ago at least. Nobody's asked me, but if they did, I'd say those heads of yours come from not eating. You're much too skinny." With that, she finally put the stocking down atop her mending basket and rose to take Egwene's cloak, and to explain that Egwene was cold as ice. That was another cause of headaches in her book. "I said I went around ignoring freezing cold or steaming heat, but your body knew whether you did or not. That's to bundle up warm and wear red shirts. Everyone knew red was warmest. Eating helped, too. An empty belly always led to shivering. You never saw her shivering, now did you?"
"Oh no, it might be a short one tonight. I don't know where my back
said
feels,
lightly,
but
which earned a soft snort of laughter and a shocked look. For all her liberties, Chaser
I might
was a
just
stickler for the proprieties to make
still
a
do
veteran
it.
seem lax. The spirits, anyway, if often not the letter. "I don't have a headache tonight, thanks to that tea of yours." Maybe it had been the tea. Vile as that tasted, as a cure, it was no
Can't wait
worse
for it
than
to heat
sitting
up.
through a session of the hall lasting more than half a day. "And I'm not very hungry, really. A roll will be enough." Of course, it was not quite so simple as that. The relationship between mistress and servant was never simple. You lived in one another's sleep, and she saw you at your worst, knew all your faults and foibles. There was no such thing as privacy from your maid. Teresa muttered and grumbled under her breath the whole time she was helping Egwene undress, and in the end, wrapped in a robe, to be sure, edged with frothy Nurandian lace and embroidered with summery flowers, a gift from Manaya, Egwene let her remove the linen cloth covering the tray on the little round table. The lentil stew was a congealed mass in the bowl. It was sad, just that. And with the first spoonful, Egwene discovered she did have some appetite. She ate every scrap, and the piece of blue-veined white cheese, and the somewhat shriveled olives, and the 2 crusty brown rolls, though she had to pick weevils out of both. Since she did not want to fall asleep too quickly, she drank only 1 cup of the spiced wine, which needed reheating too, and had a slight bitterness for it, but Chesa beamed with approval as if she had cleaned the tray. Peering at the dishes, empty except for the olive pits and a few crumbs, she realized she had at that. Once she was in her narrow cot, two soft woolen blankets and a goose-down blanket pulled to her chin. Chaser took up the dinner tray, but she paused at the tent's entrance. "Do you want me to come back, Mother? If you get one of your heads, well, that woman's found company, or she'd be here by now." There was open scorn in that woman. "I could brew another pot of tea. I got it from a peddler who said it was sovereign for aching heads. And joints and belly upsets, too." "Do you really think she's a light skirt, Chisa?" Egwene murmured. Already warm under her covers, she felt drowsy. She wanted sleep, but not that much. Heads and joints and bellies? Nynaeve would laugh herself sick to hear that. Perhaps it had been all those chattering crickets that chased her headache away after all. "Halima does flirt, I suppose, but I don't think it's ever gone beyond flirting." For a moment, Chaser was silent, pursing her lips. "She makes me
Have a little
uneasy,
wax on
Mother,"
that
she
one.
said finally. "There's something just not right about that, Halima. I feel it every time she does. It's like feeling somebody sneaking up behind me, or realizing there's a man watching me bathe, or..." She laughed, but it was an uncomfortable sound. "I don't know how to describe it. Just not right." Egwene sighed and snuggled deeper under the covers. "Good night, Chaser." Channeling briefly, she extinguished the lamp, plunging the tent into pitch blackness. "You go sleep in your own tent tonight." Halima might be upset to come and find someone else on her cot. Had the woman really broken a man's arm? The man must have provoked her somehow. She wanted dreams tonight. Untroubled dreams. At least, dreams she could recall. Few of her dreams were what anyone would call untroubled. But she had another sort of dream to enter first, and for that it had been some time since she needed to be asleep. Nor did she need one of the Terangrial, the hall guarded so closely. Slipping into a light trance was no harder than deciding to do so, especially as tired as she was, and, bodiless, she floated in an endless blackness, surrounded by an endless sea of lights, an immense swirl of tiny pinpoints glittering more sharply than stars on the clearest night, more numerous than the stars. Those were the dreams of all the people in the world, of people in all the worlds that were or could be, worlds so strange she could not begin to comprehend them, all visible here in the tiny gap between Tel'aran'rhiod and waking, the infinite space between reality and dreams. Some of those dreams she recognized at a glance. They all looked the same, yet she knew them as surely as she did the faces of her sisters. Some she avoided. Rand's dreams were always shielded, and she feared he might know when she tried to peek in. The shield would keep her from seeing anything anyway. A pity she could not tell where someone was from their dreams. 2 points of light could be side by side here, and dreamers 1,000 miles apart. Gawain's dreams tugged at her, and she fled. His dreams held their own dangers, not least because part of her wanted very much to sneak into them. Nynaeve's dreams gave her pause, and the desire to put the fear of the light into the fool woman, but Nynaeve had managed to ignore her so far, and Egwene would not sink to pulling her into Tel'aran'rhiod against her will. That was the sort of thing the Forsaken do. It was a temptation, though. Moving without moving, she searched for one particular dreamer. One of two, at least. Either would do. The lights seemed to spin around her. The sweep passed so fast that they blurred into streaks, while she floated motionless in that starry sea. She hoped that at least one of those she hunted was asleep already. The light knew it was late enough for anyone. Vaguely aware of her body in the waking world, she felt herself yawn and curl her legs up beneath her covers. Then she saw the point of light she sought, and it swelled in her sight as it shimmered toward her from a star in the sky to a full moon
Cheers,
to a
everyone.
shimmering wall that filled her vision. Pulsing
Hey,
like
Charles, how
breathing
you
air.
doing?
She did not.
I'm not doing too bad.
That could lead to all
Can't
sorts of
complain too
complications,
much.
even with this dreamer. Besides, it would be embarrassing to slide
Hell
into
yeah.
someone's dream accidentally. Reaching out with her will across the hair-fine space that remained between her and the dream, she spoke cautiously, so she would not be heard in a shout. She had no body, no mouth, no shape. Wayne, meet me at the usual place. She did not think anyone could eavesdrop, not without knowing. There was no point in taking time. The pinprick winked out. Elaine had listened, but she would remember. No, the voice had not been just part of the dream. Gray moved sideways, or perhaps it was more like completing a step that she had paused halfway through. It felt like both. She moved, and she was standing in a small room, empty save for a scarred wooden table and 3 straight-backed chairs. The 2 windows showed deep night outside, yet there was light of an odd sort, different from moonlight or lamplight or sunlight. It did not seem to come from anywhere. But it was more than enough to see that sad, sorry little room clearly. The dusty wall panels were riddled by cracks, and broken panes in the windows had allowed snow to drift in atop a litter of twigs and dead leaves. At least there was snow on the floor sometimes, and twigs and leaves sometimes. The table and chairs remained where they stood, but whenever she glanced away, the snow might be gone when she looked back, the twigs and brown leaves in different places, as if scattered by a wind. They even shifted while she was looking, simply here, then there. That no longer seemed any odder to her than the feel of unseen eyes watching. Neither was truly real, just the way things were until I revealed. A reflection of reality and dreams, all jumbled together. Everywhere in the world of dreams felt empty, but this room had the hollow emptiness that only came from a place that was truly abandoned in the waking world. Not so many months past, this little room had been the Amelin's study. The inn that held it was called the Little Tower, and the village of Salidar, reclaimed from the encroaching forest, had bustled, the heart of resistance to Elida. Now, if she walked outside, she would see saplings thrusting through the snow in the middle of those streets that had been so painfully cleared. Sisters did travel to Salidar still, to visit the dovecotes, all jealous that a pigeon sent by one of their eyes and ears might fall into another's hands, but only in the waking world. Going to the dovecotes here would be as useless as wishing for the pigeons to find you by a miracle. Tame animals seemed to have no reflections in the world of dreams, and nothing done here could touch the waking world. Sisters with access to the dream Turangrial had other places to visit than a deserted village in Altara, and certainly no one else had reason to come here in the dream either. This was one of the places in the world Egwene could be sure no one would catch her by surprise. Too many others turned out to have eavesdroppers, or deep sadness. She hated seeing what had become of the 2 rivers since she left. Waiting for Elaine to appear, she tried to quell her impatience. Elaine was not a dream walker. She needed to use a Turangreal, and she would want to tell Avienda where she was going, no doubt. Still, as the minutes stretched out, Egwene found herself piecing the rough floorboards irritably. Time flowed differently here. An hour until Aranriod could be minutes in the waking world, or the other way around. Elaine could be moving like the wind. Egwene checked her clothing. A gray riding dress with elaborate green embroidery on the bodice and in broad bands on the divided skirts. Had she been thinking of the green Aja? A simple silver net to catch her hair. Sure enough, the Amelin's long, narrow stole hung around her neck. She made the stole vanish, then after a moment allowed it to return. It was a matter of letting it come back, not consciously thinking of it. The stole was part of how she thought of herself now, and it was as Amelin that she needed to speak to Elaine. The woman who finally appeared in the room, though, just flashing into existence, was not Elaine, but Avienda, surprisingly garbed in silver-embroidered blue silk, with pale lace at her wrists and throat. The heavy bracelet of carved ivory she wore seemed as much out of place with that dress as the dream terangreal that dangled from a leather cord around her neck, a strangely twisted stone ring flecked with color. "Where is Elaine?" Egwene asked anxiously. "Is she all right?" The Aiel woman gave a startled glance at herself, and abruptly she was in a dark, bulky skirt and white blouse, with a dark shawl draped over her shoulders and a dark kerchief folded around her temples to hold the reddish hair that now hung to her waist. Longer than in life, Egwene suspected. Everything was mutable in the world of dreams. A silver necklace appeared around her neck, complicated strands of intricately worked discs that the Kandori called snowflakes, a gift from Egwene herself, what seemed a very long time ago. She could not make this work, Aviendra said, the ivory bracelet sliding on her wrist as she touched the twisted ring that still hung from its strip of leather above the necklace now. The flows kept slipping away from her. It is the babes. Suddenly she grinned. Her emerald eyes seemed almost to shine. She has a wonderful temper sometimes. She threw the ring down and jumped up and down on it. Egwene sniffed. Babes? So there was to be more than one. Oddly, Avienda took it in stride that Elaine was with child, though Egwene was convinced the woman loved Rand too. Aiel ways were peculiar, to say the least. Egwene would not have thought it of Elaine, though, and Rand. No one had actually said he was the father, and she could hardly ask something like that, but she could count, and she very much doubted that Elaine would lie with another man. She realized that she was wearing stout woolens, dark and heavy, and a shawl much thicker than Avienda's, good Two Rivers garments, the sort of clothes a woman would wear to sit in the women's circle, say when some fool woman had let herself get with child and showed no sign of marrying. A deep, relaxing breath, and she was back in her green embroidered riding dress. The rest of the world was not the same as the Two Rivers. Right. She had come far enough to know that much. She didn't have to like it, but she had to live with it. As long as she and the babes are well, right, how many? More than one could present difficulties. No, she was not going to ask. Elaine surely had the best midwife in Camelin. Best just to change the subject quickly. Have you heard from Rand or Nynaeve? I have some words for her running off with him that way. We have heard from neither, Aviendra replied, adjusting her shawl as carefully as any Aes Sedai, avoiding her Amalin's eyes. Was her tone careful, too? Egwene clicked her tongue, vexed with herself. She really was beginning to see conspiracies everywhere and suspicions in everything. Rand had gone into hiding, and that was that. Nynaeve was Aes Sedai, free to do as she wished. Even when the Amalin commanded, Aes Sedai often found to do exactly as they wished anyway. But the Amalin was still going to set Nynaeve down hard once she laid hands on her. As for Rand, I'm afraid trouble is heading your way, she said. A fine silver teapot appeared on the table, on a hammered silver tray with two delicate green porcelain cups. A thread of steam rose from the spout. She could have made the tea appear already in the cups, yet pouring seemed part of offering someone tea, even ephemeral tea with no more reality than a dream. You could die of thirst trying to drink what you found in Tel'aran'rhiod, much less what you made. But this tea tasted as if the leaves had come from a new cask, and she had put in just the right amount of honey. Taking a seat on one of the chairs, she sipped hers as she explained what had happened in the hall and why. After the first words, Avienda held her cup on her fingertips without drinking and watched it wane without blinking. Her dark skirts and pale blouse became the Codin sore, coat and trousers of gray and brown that would fade into shadows. Her long hair was suddenly short and hidden by a shofar, the black veil hanging down her chest. Incongruously, the ivory bracelet still hung from her wrist, although maidens of the sphere did not wear jewelry. All of this because of the beacon you felt, she muttered, half to herself when Egwene finished. Because they think the shadow-souled have a weapon. An odd way to put it. What else can it be? Egwene asked, curious. Did one of the wise ones say something? It had been a long time since she believed that Aes Sedai possessed all knowledge, and sometimes the wise ones revealed pockets of information that could startle the most stolid sister. Avienda frowned, and her clothing changed back to the skirt and blouse and shawl, then after a moment to the blue silk and lace, this time with both the Kandori necklace and the ivory bracelet. The dream ring remained on its cord, of course. A shawl appeared around her shoulders. The room was winter cold, yet it hardly seemed that gauzy layer of pale blue lace could provide any warmth. The wise ones are as uncertain as your Aes Sedai. Not as frightened, though, I think. Life is a dream, and everyone wakes eventually. We dance the spheres with Leaf Blighter. That name for the Dark One had always seemed strange to Egwene, coming as it did from the treeless waste. But no one enters the dance certain they will live or win. I do not think the wise ones would consider any alliance with the Ashaman. Is this wise? She added cautiously. From what you said, I cannot be certain whether you wish it. I don't see any other choice, Egwene said reluctantly. That hole is 3 miles across. This is the only hope we have that I can see. Avienda peered into her tea. And if the Shadow Soul possessed no weapon? Suddenly, Egwene realized what the other woman was doing. Avienda was in training to be a wise one, and garments or no, she was being a wise one. Likely that was the reason for the shawl. Part of Egwene wanted to smile. Her friend was changing from the often hot-headed maiden of the spear she had first come to know. Another part of her remembered that the wise ones did not always have the same goals as Aes Sedai. What sisters valued deeply sometimes meant nothing to the wise ones. It made her sad that she must think of Avienda as a wise one instead of just a friend. A wise one who would see what was good for the Aiel rather than what was good for the White Tower. Still, the question was a good one. We do have to deal with the Black Towers sooner or later, Avienda, and Moria was right. There are already too many Ashaman for any thought of gentling them all. And that's if we dared think of gentling them before the last battle. Maybe a dream will show me another way, but none has so far. None of her dreams had showed her anything useful so far. Well, not really. This does give us at least the beginning of a way to handle them. In any case, it's going to happen. If the sitters can agree on anything besides the fact they have to try for an agreement. So we must live with it. It might even be for the best in the long run. Avienda smiled into her teacup. Not an amused smile. She seemed relieved for some reason. Her voice was serious, though. You Aes Sedai always think men are fools. Quite often they are not. More often than you think, at least. Take a care with these Ashaman. Mazrim Taim is far from a fool, and I think he is a very dangerous man. The Hall is aware of that, Egwene said dryly. That he was dangerous, certainly. The other might be worth pointing out. I don't know why we're even discussing this. It's out of my hands. The important thing is that eventually sisters will decide the Black Tower is no longer any reason to stay away from Camelin, if we're going to talk with them anyway. Next week or tomorrow, you'll find sisters popping in just to look in on Elaine and see how the siege is going. What we have to decide is how to keep what we want hidden. I have a few suggestions, and I hope you have more. The notion of strange Aes Sedai appearing in the royal palace agitated Avienda to the point that she flashed from blue silk to cut-and-sore to woolen skirt and algoda blouse and back again as they talked, though she appeared not to notice. Her face remained smooth enough to suit any sister. She certainly had nothing to worry about if the visiting Aes Sedai uncovered the kinswomen, or the captive Sul'dam and Damani, or the bargain with the sea folk. But likely she was concerned about the repercussions on Elaine. The sea folk not only made the cut-and-sore appear, but a round bull-hide buckler lying beside her chair with 3 short Aiel spears. Egwene considered asking whether there was any special problem with the Windfinders, any problem beyond the usual, that was, yet she held her tongue. If Avienda did not mention it, then the matter was something she and Elaine wanted to handle themselves. Surely she would have said something if it was anything Egwene should know about. Or would she? Sighing, Egwene set her cup on the table, where it promptly disappeared, and rubbed her eyes with her fingers. Suspicion truly was part of her bones now, and she was unlikely to survive long without it. At least she did not always have to act on her suspicions, not with a friend. "You are tired," Avienda said, once again in the white blouse and dark skirt and shawl, a concerned wise one with sharp green eyes. "You do not sleep well?" "I sleep well," Egwene lied, managing a smile. Avienda and Elaine had their own worries without letting them know about her headaches. "I can't think of anything more," she said, rising. "Can you?" "Then we're done," she went on, when the other woman shook her head. "Tell Elaine to take care of herself. You take care of her, and her babes." "I will," Avienda said, now in the blue silk. "But you must take care of yourself. I think you use yourself too hard." "Sleep well and wake," she said gently, the Aiel way of saying good night, and she was gone. Egwene frowned at the spot where her friend had vanished. She was not using herself too hard, only as hard as she needed to. She slipped back to her body and discovered that it was sound asleep. That did not mean that she was asleep, or not exactly. Her body slumbered, breathing slow and deep, but she let herself slip only far enough under for dreams to come. She could just have waited until she woke and recalled the dreams then as she wrote them into the little leather-bound book that she kept at the bottom of one of her clothing chests, tucked under thin linen shifts that would not be taken out well into spring. But observing the dreams as they came saved time. She thought it might help her decipher what they meant. At least, those that were more than ordinary night fancies. There were plenty of those, often featuring Gawain, a tall, beautiful man who took her in his arms and danced with her and made love with her. Once, even in her dreams, she had shied away from thoughts of making love with him. She had blushed to think about it awake. That seemed so foolish now, so childish. She would bond him as her warder one day, somehow, and she would marry him and make love to him until he cried for mercy. Even in her sleep, she giggled at that. Other dreams were not so pleasant. Wading through waist-deep snow with trees thick all around her, knowing she had to reach the edge of the forest. But even when she glimpsed the end of the trees ahead, one blink and it receded into the distance, leaving her to flounder on. Or she was pushing a great millstone up a steep hill, but every time she was almost to the top she slipped and fell and watched the huge stone roll back to the bottom, so she had to trudge back down and begin again. Only every time the hill was higher than before. She knew enough of dreams to know where those came from, even if they had no special meaning. None beyond the fact that she was tired and had a seemingly endless task in front of her anyway. There was no help for it, though. She felt her body jerking at the laborious dreams and tried to soothe her muscles, make them relax. This sort of half-sleep was little better than none, and less if she spent the whole night thrashing around on her cot. Her efforts worked, a little. At least she only twitched through a dream of being forced to pull a cart jammed full of Aes Sedai down a muddy road. Other dreams came, betwixt and between. Nat stood on a village green playing at bowls. The thatch-roofed houses were vague, in the manner of dreams. Sometimes the roofs were slate, sometimes the houses seemed of stone, sometimes wood. But he was sharp and clear, dressed in a fine green coat and that wide-brimmed black hat, just as he had been the day he rode into Saladar. There was not another human being in sight. Rubbing the ball between his hands, he took a short run and casually rolled it across the smooth grass. All 9 pins fell, scattered as if they had been kicked. Nat turned and picked up another ball, and the pins were back upright. No, there was a fresh set of pins. The old still lay where they had fallen. He hurled the ball again, a lazy, underhanded bowl, and Egwene wanted to scream. The pins were not turned pieces of wood. They were men, standing there watching the ball roll toward them. None moved until the ball sent them flying. Matt turned to pick up another ball, and there were more new pins, new men, standing in orderly formation among the men lying sprawled on the ground as if dead. No, they were dead. Unconcerned, Matt folded. It was a true dream. She knew that long before it faded. A glimpse of a future that might come to pass, a warning of what should be watched for. True dreams were always possibilities, not certainties. She often had to remind herself of that. Dreaming was not foretelling. But this was a dire possibility. Every one of those human pins had represented thousands of men. Of that she was certain. And an illuminator was part of it. Matt had met an illuminator once, but that was long ago. This was something more recent. The illuminators were scattered, their guild houses gone. One was even working her craft with a traveling show that Elaine and Nynaeve had traveled with for a time. Matt might find an illuminator anywhere. Still, it was only a possible future. Bleak and bloodstained, but only possible. Yet she had dreamed of it at least twice. Not the same dream exactly, but always the same meaning. Come to pass? She would have to ask the wise ones to find out, and she was increasingly reluctant to do that. Every question she asked revealed something to them, and their goals were not hers. To save what they could of the Aiel, they would let the White Tower be ground to dust. She had more than any one people, any one nation to think of. More dreams. She was struggling up a narrow, rocky path along the face of a towering cliff. Clouds surrounded her, hiding the ground below and the crest above, yet she knew that both were very far away. She had to place her feet very carefully. The path was a cracked ledge barely wide enough for her to stand on, with one shoulder pressed against the cliff. A ledge littered with stones as large as her fist that could turn under a misplaced step and send her hurtling over the edge. It almost seemed this was like the dreams of pushing millstones and pulling carts, yet she knew it was a true dream. Abruptly, the ledge dropped away from under her with the crack of crumbling stone, and she caught frantically at the cliff, fingers scrabbling to find a hold. Her fingertips slid into a tiny crevice, and her fall stopped with a jolt that wrenched her arms. Feet dangling into the clouds, she listened to the falling stone crash against the cliff until the sound faded to nothing without the stone ever hitting the ground. Dimly, she could see the broken ledge to her left. 10 feet away, it might as well have been a mile off for all the chance she had of reaching it. In the other direction, the mists hid whatever remained of the path, but she thought it had to be farther away still. There was no strength in her arms. She could not pull herself up, only hang there by her fingertips until she fell. The edge of the crevice seemed as sharp as a knife under her fingers. Suddenly a woman appeared, clambering down the sheer side of the cliff out of the clouds, making her way as deftly as if she were walking downstairs. There was a sword strapped to her back. Her face wavered, never settling clearly, but the sword seemed as solid as the stone. The woman reached Egwene's level and held out one hand. "We can reach the top together," she said in a familiar drawling accent. Egwene pushed the dream away as she would have a viper. She felt her body thrash, heard herself groan in her sleep. But for a moment she could do nothing. She had dreamed of the Shanshan before, of a Shanshan woman somehow tied to her, but this was a Shanshan who would save her. No! They had put a leash on her, made her Damani. She would as soon die as be saved by a Shanshan. A very long time passed before she could address herself to calming her sleeping body. Or maybe it only seemed a long time. Not a Shanshan. Never that. Slowly the dreams returned. She was climbing another path along a cliff shrouded in clouds, but this was a broad ledge of smoothly paved white stone, and there were no rocks underfoot. The cliff itself was chalky white, and as smooth as if polished. Despite the clouds, the pale stone almost gleamed. She climbed quickly and soon realized that the ledge was spiraling around. The cliff was actually a spire. No sooner did that thought occur than she was standing on the top of it, a flat, polished disk, walled by mist. Not quite flat, though. A small white plinth stood centered in that circle, supporting an oil lamp made of clear glass. The flame on that lamp burned bright and steady, without flickering. It was white, too. Suddenly a pair of birds flashed out of the mist, two ravens black as night. Streaking across the spire top, they struck the lamp and flew on without so much as a pause. The lamp spun and wobbled, dancing around the top of the plinth, flinging off droplets of oil. Some of those drops caught fire in midair and vanished. Others fell around the short column, each supporting a tiny flickering white flame, and the lamp continued to wobble on the edge of oil. Egwene woke in darkness with a jolt. She knew. For the first time, she knew exactly what a dream meant. But why would she dream of a Shanshan woman saving her, and then of the Shanshan attacking the White Tower? An attack that would shake the Aes Sedai to their core and threaten the tower itself. Of course, it was only a possibility, but the events seen in true dreams were more likely than other possibilities. She thought she was considering calmly, but at a rough rustle of canvas from the entry flaps, she very nearly embraced the true source. Hastily she ran through novice exercises to compose herself, water flowing over smooth stones, wind blowing through high grass. Like she had been frightened. It took two to achieve any sort of calm. She opened her mouth to ask who was there. Asleep? Halima's voice muttered softly. She sounded wound up tight, almost excited. Well, I wouldn't mind a good night's sleep myself. Listening to the woman undress for bed in the dark, Egwene lay very still. If she let her know she was awake, she would have to talk with her, and at the moment that would be embarrassing. She was fairly certain that Halima had found herself company, if not for the whole night. Halima could do as she wished, of course, but Egwene was still disappointed. Wishing that she had remained asleep, she found herself slipping under once more, and this time she did not try to stop halfway. She would remember any dreams that came, and she did need some actual sleep. Chaser came bright and early to bring her breakfast on the tray and help her dress. Actually, it was early and not bright at all. There was only the merest hint of sunlight, and the lamp's light was necessary to see anything. The embers in the brazier had died down during the night, of course, and the cold that hung in the air felt gray. There might be a chance of more snow today. Halima wriggled into her silk shift and dress, making laughing jokes about how she would like to have a maid, while Chaser was doing up the rows of buttons that ran down Egwene's back. The plump woman wore a set face, ignoring Halima altogether. Egwene said nothing. She said nothing very determinedly. Halima was not her servant. She had no right to set standards for the woman. Just as Chaser finished the last of the tiny
finish
buttons
this
and pulled
one,
Egwene's arm apart,
and then we'll do a
ducked
dab.
into the tent, letting in a fresh wave of cold air. The brief glimpse afforded before the flaps fell behind her showed that it was still gray outside. Definitely a chance of snow. I must speak to the mother alone, she said, folding her cloak around her as if she already felt the snow. Such a firm tone was unusual from the small woman. Egwene nodded to Chaser, who curtsied but still cautioned, Now don't let your breakfast get cold, on her way out of the tent. Halima paused, eyeing Misao and Egwene both, before scooping up her cloak from where it lay in an untidy heap at the foot of her cot. I suppose the law has worked for me, she said, sounding irritated. Misao frowned at the woman's back as she left, but without saying anything, she embraced Sidar and wove a ward against eavesdropping around her and Egwene, without asking permission. Anaya and her warder are dead, she said. Some of the workmen bringing in sacks of coals last night heard a noise like someone thrashing around, and for a wonder they all went running to see what it was. They found Anaya and Setagana lying in the snow, dead. Egwene sat down slowly on her chair, which did not feel particularly comfortable at the moment. Anaya, dead. She had had no beauty except her smile, but when she smiled, it warmed everything around her. A plain-faced woman who loved lace on her robes. Egwene knew she should feel sadness for Setagana, too, but he had been a warder. If he had survived Anaya, it was unlikely he would have lived long. How? She said. Misao would not have woven that ward just to tell her Anaya was dead. Misao's face tightened, and despite the ward, she looked over her shoulder as if she feared someone might be listening at the entry flaps. The workmen thought they had eaten badly preserved mushrooms. Some farmers are careless in gathering what they intend to sell, and the wrong sort can paralyze your lungs or make your throat swell up so you die struggling for air. Egwene nodded impatiently. She'd grown up in a country village, after all. Everyone seemed willing to accept that, Misao went on, but she did not hurry. Hands twisting and flexing on the edges of her cloak, she appeared reluctant to reach her conclusion. There were no wounds, no injuries of any sort, no reason to think it was anything but a greedy farmer selling bad mushrooms. But she sighed, glancing over her shoulder again, and lowered her voice. I suppose it was all the talk of the Black Tower and Hall today. I tested for resonance. They were killed with Saidin. A grimace of disgust crossed her face. I think someone just wove solid flows of air around their heads and let them smother. Shuddering, she drew her cloak closer. Egwene wanted to shudder, too. She was surprised she did not. Anaya dead, smothered. A deliberately cruel way of killing used by someone who had hoped to leave no traces. Have you told anyone yet? Of course not, Misao said indignantly. I came to you straight away, as soon as I knew you'd be awake at least. A pity. You'll have to explain why you delayed. We can't keep the secret. Well, Amerlins had kept darker secrets for the good of the tower as they saw it. If we have a man who can channel among us, then the sisters need to be on their guard. A man who could channel hiding among the workmen or soldiers seemed unlikely, but less so than one coming there just to kill a single sister and her warder. Which raised another question. Why Anaya? Was she just in the wrong place at the wrong time, Misao? Where did they die? Near the wagons on the south side of camp. I don't know why they were there that time of night, unless Anaya was going to the privies and Setagana thought she needed guarding even there. Then you're going to find out for me, Misao. What were Anaya and Setagana doing out when everybody else was asleep? Why were they killed? This you will keep secret. Until you can give me reasons, no one but the two of us is to know you're looking for any. Misao's mouth opened and closed. If I must, she muttered, only half under her breath. She was not really suited to keeping deep secrets, and she knew it. The last she had tried to keep had led directly to her having to swear fealty to Egwene. Will this put a stop to talk about an agreement with the Black Tower? I doubt it, Egwene said wearily. Light, how could she be weary already? The sun was not fully up yet. Either way, I think it is going to be another very long day. And the best she could find to hope for in it was that she could make it to another night without a headache. Chapter 21. A Mark. Alviarin stepped through the gateway, letting it snap shut behind her in a fading slash of brilliant blue-white, and almost immediately sneezed from the dust kicked up by her shoes. At once another sneeze racked her, and then another that brought tears to her eyes. Lit only by the glowing globe that floated in front of her, the rough-walled storeroom, hewn out of the bedrock 3 levels below the tower library, was empty, except for centuries' worth of dust. She would much rather have returned straight to her apartments in the tower itself, but there was always the chance of walking in to find a servant cleaning, and then she would have to get rid of the body and hope that no one remembered that the servant had last been seen going into her rooms. Remain hidden and rouse not even the slightest hint of suspicion Masana had commanded. That seemed over-timid when the Black Adra had walked the tower with impunity since its founding, but when one of the chosen commanded, only a fool disobeyed. At least, if there was any chance of being found out. Irritably, Alviarin channeled to force the dust out of the air, slamming it down so hard that the stone floor should have shaken. She would not have to go through this every time if she simply swept all the dust into a corner rather than leaving it spread out. No one else had come this far into the library basements in years. No one would notice the room was clean. But someone was always doing what no one ever did. She often did so herself, and she did not intend to be caught through a foolish mistake. Still, she grumbled under her breath as she channeled the reddish mud from her shoes and the hem of her skirts and cloak. It seemed unlikely that anyone would recognize it as coming from Tremalkin, the largest of the Seafolk Islands, but someone might wonder where she had been to get muddy. The tower grounds would be buried in snow except where they had been shoveled clear and the dirt frozen hard. Still muttering to herself, she channeled again to muffle the squeal of rusted hinges as she pushed open the rough wooden door. There was a way to make a weave and hide it, so she would not have to soften that creak every time. She was certain there was. But Masana refused to teach it to her. Masana was the real source of her annoyance. The Chosen taught what she wished and nothing more, hinted at wonders, then withheld them. And Masana used her like an errand girl. She sat at the head of the Supreme Council and knew the names of every black sister in every heart, which was more than Masana could say. The woman showed little interest in who would carry out her orders so long as they were carried out and to the absolute letter. All too often she wanted them carried out by Alviarin herself, forcing her to deal with women and men who thought themselves her equals, just because they also served the Great Lord. Too many of the friends thought themselves equal to Aes Sedai, or even superior. Worse, Masana forbade her to make an object lesson of even one. Repellent little rodents, none able to channel, and Alviarin had to be polite just because some of them might be serving another of the Chosen. It was obvious that Masana did not know for sure. She was one of the Chosen, and she made Alviarin smile at the dust of the street for her uncertainty. The ball of pale light floating ahead of her for illumination, Alviarin glided down the rough stone corridor, smoothing the dust behind with feathery brushes of air, so it would seem undisturbed, and rehearsing several choice things she would like to say to Masana. She would actually say none of them, of course, which only honed her irritation. Criticizing one of the Chosen in even the mildest terms was a short path to pain, perhaps to death. Almost surely both, in truth. With the Chosen, grovel and obey was the only way to survive, and the first was as important as the second. The prize of immortality was worth a little groveling. With that, she could gain all the power she wished, much more than any Amelin had ever wielded. First, though, it was necessary to survive. Once she reached the top of the first ramp leading upward, she no longer bothered hiding her traces. There was not nearly so much dust here, and that marked by the wheels of hand carts and scuffs from shoes. Another set of faint footprints would never be noticed. She still walked quickly, though. Usually the thought of living forever frightened her, the thought of eventually wielding power through Masana as she now did through Elida. Well, almost the same. Expecting to bring Masana to Elida's state of compliance was too ambitious, but she could still tie strings to the woman that would assure her own rise. Today her mind kept returning to the fact that she had been out of the tower for almost a month. Masana would not have bothered to keep Elida under control during her absence, though the Chosen would surely lay the fault at Alviarin's feet if anything had gone amiss. Of course, Elida was properly cowed after the last time. The woman had begged for release from taking private penances from the mistress of novices. Of course, she was too cowed to have stepped out of line. Of course. Alviarin pushed Elida firmly to the back of her head, but she did not slow her steps. A second ramp took her to the highest basement, where she let the glowing ball vanish and released Saidar. The shadows here were dotted with pools of wan light that nearly touched one another, cast by lamps sitting in iron brackets along stone walls that were neatly dressed on this level. Nothing moved except for a rat that went scuttling away with a faint click of claws on the floor stones. That almost made her smile. Almost. The great lord's eyes riddled the tower now, though no one seemed to have noticed that the wardings had failed. She did not think it was anything Masana had done. The wards simply no longer worked as they were supposed to. There were gaps. She certainly did not care whether the animal saw her or reported what it had seen, but she still ducked quickly into a narrow circular staircase. There might be people about on this level, and people were not to be trusted the same as rats. Perhaps, she thought as she climbed, she could probe Masana about that impossible flare in the power, so long as she was delicate. The Chosen would think she was hiding something if she never mentioned it. Every woman who could channel in the whole world had to be wondering what had happened. She would just have to be careful not to let slip anything that suggested that she had actually visited the site. Long after the flare vanished, of course. She was not stupid enough to simply stroll into that. But Masana seemed to think Alviarin should carry out her chores without taking a moment for herself. Could the woman really believe that she had no affairs of her own to see to? It was best to behave as if she did have none. For the moment it was, at least. In the shadows at the top of the stairs, she stopped in front of the small plain door, roughly finished on this side, in order to take hold of herself as she folded her cloak over her arm. Masana was one of the Chosen, but still human. Masana made mistakes, and she would kill Alviarin in a heartbeat if she made one. Grovel, obey, and survive, and always be wary. She had known that long before meeting one of the Chosen. Retrieving the white keeper's stole from her belt pouch, she settled it around her neck and cracked the door carefully to listen. Silence, as expected. She stepped out into the ninth depository and closed the door behind her. On the inner side, the door was no less plain, but polished to a soft glow. The tower library was divided into 12 depositories, at least insofar as the world knew, and the ninth was the smallest, given over to texts on various forms of arithmetic. Yet it was still a large chamber, a long oval with a flattened dome for a ceiling, filled with row on row of tall wooden shelves, each surrounded by a narrow walkway 4 paces above the 7-colored floor tiles. Tall ladders stood alongside the shelves, on wheels so they could be moved easily, both on the floor and on the walkways, and mirrored brass stand lamps with bases so heavy that each took 3 or 4 men to move. Fire was a constant concern
Okay,
in the
got the
library.
dab ready, but
The stand lamps
give me
all
1
burned
second, I'll be
brightly,
right back.
ready to light the way for any sister who wanted to find a book or boxed manuscript. But a shelved handcart holding 3 large leather-cased volumes to be replaced was still in the middle of one aisle, exactly where she remembered it from the last time she walked through. She did not understand why there was any need for different forms of arithmetic, or why so many books had been written on them, and for all the tower prided itself on having the greatest collection of books in the world covering every possible topic, it seemed that most Aes Sedai agreed with her. She had never seen another sister in the ninth depository, the reason she used it for her entryway. At the wide arched doors, standing invitingly open, she listened until she was satisfied that the corridor beyond was empty before slipping out. Anyone would have thought it strange that she had developed an interest for the books in there. As she hurried along the main corridors, where the floor tiles were laid in repeating rows of the Aja colors, it came to her that the library was more silent than usual, even counting how few Aes Sedai remained in the tower at present. There was always a sister or two to be seen, if only the librarians. Some Browns actually maintained apartments in the upper levels in addition to their rooms in the tower. Yet the huge figures carved into the corridor's walls, fancifully garbed people and strange animals 10 feet tall or more, might have been the library's only inhabitants. Drafts made the intricately carved lamp wheels, hanging 10 paces overhead, creak faintly on their chains. Her footsteps seemed unnaturally loud, casting soft echoes from the vaulted ceiling. "May I help you?" a woman's voice said quietly behind her. Startled, Alviarin spun around, almost dropping her cloak before she could catch herself. "I just wanted to walk through the library, Zamila," she said. and immediately felt a stab of irritation. If she was jumpy enough to explain herself to a librarian, then she really did need to take a grip before she reported to Masana. She almost wanted to tell Zamila what was happening on Tremalki, just to see whether the woman would flinch. The bland expression on the Brown sister's dark face did not change, but a touch of some unreadable emotion altered the pitch of her voice. Tall and very lean, Zamila always held that outer mask of reserve and distance, but Albiaran suspected she was less shy than she pretended, and less pleasant. That's quite understandable. The library is restful, and it's a sad time for us all. And sadder still for you, of course. Of course, Albiaran repeated, as if by rote. A sad time? For her in particular? She considered drawing the woman to some secluded corner where she could be questioned and disposed of, but then she noticed another brow, a round woman even darker than Zamila, watching them from farther down the hall. Aiden and Zamila were weak in the power, yet overcoming both at once would be difficult if it was possible at all. Why were they both down here on the ground floor? The pair was seldom seen, shuttling between the rooms on the upper levels they shared with Niane, the third Seafolk sister, and the so-called 13th depository where the secret records were kept. All three worked there, willingly immersed to their necks in their labors. She walked on and tried to tell herself she was being skittish without reason, but that did nothing to soothe the prickling between her shoulder blades. The lack of librarians guarding the front entrance only made the prickles grow. Librarians always stood at every entrance to make sure not a scrap of paper left the library without their knowledge. Albiaran channeled to shove one of the tall carved doors open before she reached it, and left it swinging agape on its bronze hinges as she hurried down the wide marble stairs. The broad oak-lined stone path that led toward the tall white shaft of the tower had been shoveled clear, but if it had not been, she would have used the power to melt the snow away ahead of her, let anyone think of it what they would. Masana had made crystal clear the price of taking the risk that anyone might learn the weave for traveling, or even that she knew it, else she would have traveled from the spot. With the tower in sight, looming over the trees and gleaming in the pale morning sunlight, she could have been there in a step. Instead, she fought the urge to run. It was no surprise to find the tower's wide, tall corridors empty. A few scurrying servants with the white flame of Tarvalin on their breasts followed their bows and curtsies as she passed, but they were no more use, no more important, than the draughts that made the gilded stand lamps flicker and rippled the bright tapestries hanging on the snowy white walls. They were kept to their own Ajah quarters, as possible these days, of course, and unless she encountered a member of her own heart, even three Aes Sedai she knew was Black Ajah would have been useless. She knew them, but they did not know her. Besides, she was not about to reveal herself to anyone she did not have to. Perhaps some of those marvelous instruments from the Age of Legends that Masana talked about would allow her to question any sister immediately one day, if the woman ever actually produced them. But now it was still a matter of ciphered orders left on pillows or in secret spots. What had once seemed almost instantaneous responses now seemed interminably delayed. A stocky, bald-headed serving man making his bow gulped audibly, and she smoothed her features. She prided herself on her icy detachment, always presenting a cool, unruffled surface. In any event, scowling her way through the tower was going to get her exactly nowhere. There was one person in the tower she was sure she knew exactly where to find, someone she could demand answers from with no fear of what the woman told. A little caution was needed even there, of course. Careless questions revealed more than most answers were worth. But Elida would tell her anything. With a sigh, she began to climb. Masana had told her of another marvel of the Age of Legends that she wished very much to see, a thing called a lift. The flying machines sounded much grander, of course, but it was far easier to envision a mechanical contrivance that whisked you from floor to floor. She was not really certain that buildings several times as high as the White Tower could really have existed either. In the whole world, not even the Stone of Tyr rivaled the tower's height. but just knowing about lifts made climbing up spiraling hallways and sweeping flights of stairs seem laborious. She did pause at the Amelin's study, only 3 levels up, but as expected, both rooms were empty, the bare writing tables polished till they shone. The rooms themselves seemed bare, with no wall hangings, no ornaments, nothing at all but the tables and chairs and unlit stand lamps. Elida rarely came down from her apartments near the tower's peak anymore. That had seemed acceptable at one time, since it isolated the woman even more from the rest of the tower. Few sisters made that climb willingly. Today, though, by the time Alviarin had climbed close to 80 spans, she was seriously considering making Elida move back down. Elida's waiting room was empty, of course, though a folder of papers sitting atop the writing table said someone had been there. Seeing what they contained and deciding whether Elida needed to be punished for having it could wait, though. Alviarin tossed her cloak down on the writing table and pushed open the door, newly carved with the flame of Tarvalin and awaiting the gilder, that led deeper into the apartments. She was surprised at the surge of relief she felt at seeing Elida sitting behind the starkly carved and gilded writing table, the 7-striped, no, 6-striped now, stole around her neck, and the flame of Tarvalin picked out in moonstones among the goldwork on the high chair-back above her head. A niggling worry that she had not let surface until now had been the possibility that the woman was dead in some fool accident. That would have explained Zamila's comment. Choosing a new Amerlin could have taken months, even with the rebels and everything else confronting them, but her days as keeper would have been numbered. What surprised her more than her relief, though, was the presence of more than half the sitters in the hall standing in front of the writing table in their fringed shawls. Elida knew better than to entertain this sort of delegation without her present. The huge gilded case clock against the wall, a vulgarly over-ornamented piece, chimed twice for high. Small enameled figures of Aes Sedai popping out of tiny doors in its front as she opened her mouth to tell the sitters that she needed to confer with the Amelin privately. They would leave with little hemming or hawing. A keeper had no authority to order them out, but they knew that her authority extended beyond that her stole conferred, even if they did not begin to suspect how that could be. "Oh, the Aaron," Elida said, sounding surprised before she could get a word out. The hardness of Elida's face softened in what almost seemed pleasure. Her mouth worked close to a smile. Elida had had no reasons to smile in some time. "Stand over there and be quiet until I have time to deal with you," she said, waving an imperious hand toward a corner of the room. The sitters shifted their feet and adjusted their shawls. Suana, a beefy woman, gave Alviarin a tight glance, and Shavan, tall as a man and angular, stared straight at her with no expression, but the others avoided meeting her eye. Stunned, she stood stock-still on the brightly patterned silk carpet, gaping. This could not be mere rebellion on Elida's part. The woman would have to be insane. But what in the name of the great Lord had happened to give her the nerve? What? Elida's hand slapped the tabletop with a loud crack, a blow that made one of the lacquered boxes there rattle. "When I tell you to stand in the corner, daughter," she said in a low, dangerous voice, "I expect you to obey." Her eyes glittered. "Or shall I summon the Mistress of Novices so these sisters can witness your private penance?" Heat suffused Alviarin's face, part humiliation and part anger. To have anyone hear such things said, and to her face. Fear bubbled in her, too, turning her stomach to acid. A few words from her, and Elida would stand accused of sending sisters to disaster and captivity not once, but twice. Rumors had already begun swirling about events in Kyrian, murky rumors, but growing more certain by the day. And once it was learned that on top of that, Elida had sent 50 sisters to try to defeat hundreds of men who could channel. Not even the existence of the rebel sisters wintering in Nuremberg with their army would keep the Amelin stole on her shoulders or her head. She could not dare to do this. Unless she could discredit Alviarin as Black Aja, that might gain her a little time. Only a little, surely, once the facts about Dumai's wells and the Black Tower were known, but Elida might be ready to grasp at straws. No, it was not possible. Could not be possible. Flight certainly was impossible. For one thing, if Elida was ready to lay charges, flight would only confirm them. For another, Masana would find her and kill her if she fled. All that flashed through her head as she moved on leaden feet to stand in the corner like a penitent novice. There had to be a way to recover from this, whatever had happened. There was always a way to recover. Listening might find it for her. She would have prayed if the Dark Lord listened to prayers. Elida studied her for a moment, then gave a satisfied nod. The woman's eyes still shone with emotion, though. Lifting the lid of one of the 3 lacquered boxes on her table, she took out a small, age-darkened ivory carving of a turtle and stroked it between her fingers. Fondling the carvings in that box was a habit she had when she wanted to soothe her nerves. "Now," she said, "you were explaining to me why I should enter negotiations." "We were not asking permission, Mother," Suana said sharply, thrusting her chin out. She had too much chin, a square stone of it, and the arrogance to thrust it at anyone. "A decision of this sort belongs to the Hall. There is strong feeling in favor of it in the Yellow Aja," which meant she had strong feelings. She was the head of the Yellow Aja, the first weaver, something Alviarin knew because the Black Aja knew all the Aja secrets, or nearly all, and in Suana's view, her opinions were her Aja's opinions. Doacine, the other yellow present, eyed Suana sideways, but said nothing. Pale and boyishly slim, Doacine looked as if she did not really want to be there, a pretty sulky boy who had been dragged somewhere by his ear. Sitters often balked at arm twisting from their Aja's head, yet it was not beyond possibility that Suana had found some way. "Many whites also support talks," Farana said, frowning distractedly at an ink stain on one plump finger. "It is the logical thing to do under the present circumstances." She was first Weaseler, head of the White Aja, but less likely than Suana to take her own views for those of the entire Aja. A little less likely. Farana often seemed as vague as the worst of the Browns. The long black hair that framed her round face needed a brush, and part of the fringe on her shawl appeared to have been dipped carelessly in her breakfast tea, but she could catch the slightest crack in the logic of an argument. She might well have been there by herself, because she simply did not believe she needed any assistance from the other white sitters. Leaning back in her tall chair, Elida began to glower, her fingers stroking faster on the turtle, and Andaya spoke up quickly, not quite looking at Elida, while pretending to adjust the set of her gray-fringed shawl along her arms. "The point, Mother, is that we must find a way to end this peacefully," she said, the Tarabana accent strong in her speech as it was when she felt uneasy. Frequently diffident around Elida, she glanced at Yukiri as though hoping for support, but the slender little woman turned her head aside slightly. Yukiri was remarkably stubborn for such a tiny woman. Unlike Doacine, she would not have responded to arm twisting. So why was she here if she did not want to be? Realizing that she was on her own, Andaya rushed on. "It must not be allowed to come to fighting in the streets of Tarvala, or in the tower, especially not again. So far the rebels seem content to sit and watch the city, but that cannot last. They have rediscovered how to travel, Mother, and have used it to carry an army across hundreds of leagues. We must begin talks before they all decide to use traveling to bring that army into Tarvalan, or all is lost, even if we win." Fists knotted in her skirts, Alviarin swallowed hard. She thought her eyes might pop out of her head. The rebels knew how to travel. They were here at Tarvalan already, and these fools wanted to talk? She could see carefully laid plans, carefully arranged designs, evaporating like mist in a summer sun. Perhaps the Dark Lord would listen if she prayed very hard. Elida's scowl did not diminish, but she set the ivory turtle down very carefully, and her voice came close to normal. the old normal, before Alviarin reined her in with a steel core beneath the softness of the words. Do the brown and the green also support talks? The brown, Siobhan began, then pursed her lips in thought and visibly changed what she had intended to say. Outwardly she seemed utterly composed, yet she was rubbing her long thumbs against her bony forefingers unconsciously. The brown is quite clear on the historical precedents. You have all read the secret histories, or should have. Whenever the tower has been divided against itself, disaster has struck the world. With the last battle looming in a world that contains the Black Tower, we can no longer afford to remain divided a day longer than need be. It hardly seemed that Elida's face could grow darker, but mention of the Black Tower did it. And the green? Her voice was still controlled. All three green sitters were there, indicating very strong support among their Aja, or heavy pressure from the head of the green. As senior, Taline should have answered Elida. Greens stuck to their hierarchies in everything, but the tall, golden-haired woman glanced at Yukiri for some reason, then just as oddly at Doacine, and put her eyes on the carpet and stood plucking at her green silk skirts. Rena frowned faintly, wrinkling her upturned nose in puzzlement, but she had worn the shawl for fewer than 50 years, so it was left to Rubinda to reply. A sturdy woman, Rubinda appeared short and stocky alongside Taline, and almost plain, despite eyes the color of sapphires. I'm instructed to make the same points as Siobhan, she said, ignoring the startled look that Rena gave her. Plainly there had been pressure from Adalorna, the Green Captain General, and plainly Rubinda disagreed if she was willing to make it public. Tarman Gaiden is coming. The Black Tower is almost as great a threat, and the Dragon Reborn is missing if he isn't dead. We can no longer afford to be divided. If Andaya can talk the rebels back into the tower, then we must let her try. I see, Elida said in a flat tone. But strangely, her color improved, and the hint of a smile even touched her mouth. Then by all means talk them back if you can, but my edicts stand. The Blue Aja no longer exists, and every sister who follows that child Egwene Aldir must serve penance under my guidance before she can be readmitted to any Aja. I intend to weld the White Tower into a weapon to use at Tarman Gaiden. Farana and Suana opened their mouths, protest painted on their faces, but Elida cut them off with a raised hand. I have spoken, daughters. Leave me now, and see to your talks. There was nothing the sitters could do short of open defiance. What was the Hall's right was theirs, but the Hall seldom dared infringe far on the Amelin seat's authority, not unless the Hall was united against the Amelin, and this Hall was anything but united on any point. Alviarin had helped ensure that herself. They left, Farana and Suana, stiff-backed and tight-lipped, and Daya almost scurrying. None of them so much as glanced in Alviarin's direction. She barely waited for the door to close behind the last. This really changes nothing, Elida. Surely you see that. You must think clearly, not trip over a momentary aberration. She knew she was babbling, but she did not seem to stop. The disaster at Dumai's Wells, the certain disaster at the Black Tower, these can still unseat you. You need me to hold on to the staff and stole. You need me, Elida. She clamped her teeth shut before her tongue threw everything away. You still had to be away. I'm surprised you returned, Elida said, rising and smoothing her red-slashed skirts. She had never given up her way of dressing as a red. Strangely, she was smiling as she came around the table. Not a hint at a smile, but a full, pleased curve of her lips. Have you been hiding somewhere in the city since the rebels arrived? I thought you'd have taken ship as soon as you learned they were here. Who would have thought they would rediscover traveling? Imagine what we can do once we know that. Smiling, she glided across the carpet. Now let me see. What do I have to hear from you? The stories out of Clarion are the talk of the tower. But even if sisters really were obeying the Althor boy, which I, for one, cannot believe, everyone blames Coirin. She had the responsibility of bringing him here, and she has as good as been tried and convicted in the minds of the sisters. Elida stopped in front of Alviarin, hemming her into the corner. That smile never touched her eyes. She smiled, and her eyes glittered. Alviarin could not break away from that gaze. In the last week, we've heard a good many things about the Black Tower as well. Elida's lips twisted in disgust around the name. It seems there are even more men than you suppose. But everyone thinks Tovane must have had the sense to learn that before she attacked. There has been a good deal of discussion over it. If she comes dragging back here defeated, she will harvest the blame. So your threats... Alviarin staggered into the wall, blinking away spots before she even realized that the other woman had slapped her. Her cheek already felt swollen. The glow of Saidar had surrounded Elida, and the shield settled on Alviarin before she could twitch, cutting her off from the power. But Elida did not intend to use the power. She drew back her fist, still smiling. Slowly, the woman drew a deep breath and let her hand fall. She did not remove the shield, however. "Would you really use that?" she asked in an almost mild tone. Alviarin's hand sprang away from the hilt of her belt knife. Grabbing it had been a reflex, but even if Elida had not been holding the power, killing her when so many sitters knew they were together would have been as good as killing herself. Still, her face burned when Elida sniffed contemptuously. "I look forward to seeing your neck stretched on the headsman's block for treason, Alviarin. But until I have the proof I need, there are still a few things I can do. Do you remember how many times you had Sylviana come to give me private penance? I hope you do, because you are going to take 10 for every day I suffered. And, oh, yes." With a jerk, she pulled the keeper's stole roughly from Alviarin's neck. "Since no one could find you when the rebels arrived, I asked the hall to remove you as keeper. Not the full hall, of course. You may still have a little influence there. But it was surprisingly easy to gain the consensus from those who were sitting that day. A keeper is supposed to be with her armament, not wandering off on her own. On second thought, you may not have any influence at all, since it turns out you were hiding in the city all along. Or did you sail back to find disaster and actually think you could recover something from the ruins? No matter. It might have been better for you to leap on the first ship you could find leaving Tarvalin. But I must admit, the thought of you scuttling from village to village, ashamed to show your face to another sister, pales beside the pleasure I'll take seeing you suffer. Now get out of my sight before I decide it should be the birch rather than Sylviana's strap." Tossing the white stole to the floor, she turned her back and released Saidar, gliding toward her chair as if Alviarin had ceased to exist. Alviarin did not leave. She fled, running with the feel of the dark hound's breath on the back of her neck. She had barely been able to think since she heard the word treason. That word, echoing in her head, made her want to howl. Treason could only mean one thing. Elida knew, and she was searching for proof. The Dark Lord have mercy. But he never did. Mercy was for those afraid to be strong. She was not afraid. She was a skin stuffed to bursting with terror. Back down through the tower she fled, and if there was so much as a servant in the hallways, she did not see him. Horror blinded her eyes to anything not directly in her path. All the way back down to the 6th level she ran, to her own apartments. At least, she supposed they were still hers for the moment. The rooms with their balcony overlooking the great square in front of the tower went with the office of keeper. For the moment it was enough that she still had rooms and a chance to live. The furnishings were still the Damani pieces left by the previous occupant, all pale-striped wood, inlaid with pearl shell and amber. In the bedchamber she threw open one of the wardrobes and fell to her knees, pushing aside dresses to rummage in the back for a small chest, a box less than 2 hands square that had been hers for many years. The carving on the box was intricate but clumsy, rows of varied knots apparently done by a carver with more ambition than skill. Her hands shook as she carried it to a table, and she set it down to wipe clammy palms on her dress. The trick to opening the box was simply a matter of spreading her fingers as wide as they would go to press simultaneously at 4 knots in the carving, no two alike. The lid lifted slightly and she threw it back, revealing her most precious possession wrapped in a small bundle of brown cloth to keep it from rattling if a maid shook the box. Most tower servants would not risk stealing, but most did not mean all. For a moment Alviarin only stared at the package, her most precious possession, a thing from the age of legends, but she had never dared use it before. Only in the worst emergency, Misana had said, the most desperate need. Yet what need could be more dire than this? Masana said the thing could take hammer blows without breaking, but she undid the wrappings with the care she would have used with a piece of fine-blown glass, revealing a Turanbrial, a brilliant red rod no larger than her forefinger, utterly smooth except for a few fine lines worked into the surface of a sinuous, interconnecting pattern. Embracing the source, she touched that pattern with hair-thin flows of fire and earth at 2 of the interconnections. That would not have been necessary in the age of legends, but something called the standing flows no longer existed. A world where almost any Terangrial could be used by people unable to channel seemed odd beyond comprehension. Why had it been allowed? Pressing one end of the rod hard with her thumb, the one power was not enough by itself. She sat down heavily and leaned against the chair's low back, staring at the thing in her hand. It was done. She felt hollow now, a vast empty space with fears fluttering through the darkness like enormous bats. Instead of rewrapping the Terangrial, she tucked it into her belt pouch and got up long enough to stuff the box back into the wardrobe. Until she knew she was safe, she did not intend to let that rod out of her possession. But then all she could do was sit and wait, rocking back and forth with her hands clasped between her knees. She could not stop rocking any more than she could stop the low moans that trickled between her teeth. Since the founding of the tower, no sister had ever been charged with being Black Aja. Oh, there had been suspicions by individual sisters, and from time to time Aes Sedai had died to make sure those suspicions never went further, but never had it come to official charges. If Elida was willing to speak openly of the headsman's block, she must be close to bringing charges, very close. Black sisters had been made to disappear too when suspicions grew too great. The Black Aja remained hidden, whatever the cost. She wished she could stop moaning. Suddenly the light in the room dimmed, enveloping the chamber in swirling twilight shadows. The sunlight at the casements seemed unable to penetrate beyond the glass panes. Alviarin was on her knees in a breath, eyes down. She trembled with wanting to pour out her fears, but with the chosen the forms must be followed. "I live to serve, great mistress," she said, and nothing more. She could not waste a moment, much less an hour, screaming in pain. Her hands were clutched together to keep them from shaking. "What is your grave emergency, child?" It was a woman's voice, but a voice of crystal chimes. Displeased chimes. Only displeased. Angry chimes might have meant death on the spot. "If you think I will raise a finger to get the keeper's stole back for you, you are sadly mistaken. You can still do what I wish done with a little extra effort, and you may consider your penances with the mistress of novices a small punishment from me. I did warn you about pushing Elida quite so hard." Alviarin swallowed her protests. Elida was not a woman to bend without hard pushing. Masana had to know that. But protests could be dangerous with the chosen. Many things were dangerous with the chosen. In any case, Sylviana's strap was a trifle compared to the headsman's axe. "Elida knows, great mistress," she breathed, raising her eyes. In front of her stood a woman of light and shadow, clothed in light and shadow, all stark blacks and silvery whites that flowed from one to the other and back. Silver eyes frowned from a face of smoke, with silver lips drawn in a tight line. It was only illusion, and really not done any better than Alviarin could have. A flash of green silk skirt embroidered with elaborate bands of bronze showed as Masana glided across the Damani carpet. But Alviarin could not see the weaves that made the illusion any more than she had felt those the woman had used to arrive or cast the whirling shadows. For all she could sense, Masana could not channel at all. The lust for those two secrets usually cut at her, but today she hardly noticed. She knows I am Black Aja, great mistress. If she has uncovered me, then she has had someone digging deep. Dozens of us may be at risk, perhaps all of us. Best to make a threat as large as possible if you wanted to be sure of a response. It might even be so. But Masana's response was a dismissive wave of one now silver hand. Her face glowed like a moon around eyes blacker than coals. That is ridiculous. Elida cannot decide from one day to the next whether she even believes the Black Aja exists. You are just trying to save yourself a little pain. Perhaps a little more will instruct you in your error. Alviarin began to plead as Masana raised that hand higher, and the weave she remembered much too well formed in the air. She had to make the woman understand. Abruptly, the shadows in the room lurched. Everything seemed to shift sideways as the darkness thickened in midnight lumps. And then the darkness was gone. Startled, Alviarin found herself with her begging hands stretched up toward a blue-eyed woman of flesh and blood, garbed in bronze-embroidered green. A tantalizingly familiar woman who looked just short of her middle years. She had known Masana walked the tower disguised as one of the sisters, though no chosen she had met showed any sign of agelessness. But she could not match that face to any name, and she realized something else as well. That face was afraid, hiding it, but afraid. She's been very useful, Masana said, not sounding afraid at all, in a voice that tugged the edge of recognition. And now I will have to kill her. You were always overly wasteful, replied a harsh voice, like rotten bone crumbling underfoot. Alviarin fell over in shock at the tall shape of a man in sinuous black armor, all overlapping plates like the scales of a snake, standing in front of one window. It was not a man, though. That bloodless face had no eyes, just smooth dead white skin where they should have been. She had encountered Murdral before in the service of the Dark Lord, and even managed to meet their eyeless gazes without giving way to the terror those stares engendered. But this one made her scrabble back across the floor until her back jarred a leg at the table. Lurks were alike as two raindrops, tall and lean and identical, but this one stood a head taller, and fear seemed to radiate from it, soaking into her bones. Unthinking, she reached for the source, and nearly screamed. The source was gone. She was not shielded. There was simply nothing there for her to embrace. The Murdral looked at her and smiled. Lurks never smiled. Never. Her breath came in ragged panting. She can be useful, the Murdral rasped. I would not want the Black Aja destroyed. Who are you to challenge one of the chosen? Masana demanded contemptuously, then ruined the effect by licking her lips. Do you think Hand of the Shadow is just a name? The Murderer's voice no longer grated. Hollow, it seemed to boom down caverns from some unimaginable distance. The creature grew as it spoke, swelling in size till its head brushed the ceiling over two spans up. You were summoned, and you did not come. My hand reaches far, Masana. Shaking visibly, the Chosen opened her mouth, perhaps to plead, but suddenly black fire flashed around her, and she screamed as her clothing fell away in dust. Bands of black flame bound her arms to her sides, wrapped tight around her legs, and a seething ball of black appeared in her mouth, forcing her jaws wide. She writhed there, standing naked and helpless, and the look in her rolling eyes made Alviarin want to soil herself. Do you want to know why one of the chosen must be punished? The voice was a bone-grating rasp once more, the Murdral seemingly only a too-tall lurk, but Alviarin was not fooled. Do you want to watch? It asked. She should go face down on the floor, grovel for her life, but she could not move. She could not look away from that eyeless stare. No, great lord, she managed with a mouth as dry as dust. She knew it could not be, but she knew. Tears were rolling down her cheeks, she realized. The Murdral smiled again. Many have fallen from great heights for wanting to know too much. It flowed toward her. No, not it. The great lord, clothed in the skin of a Murdral, flowed toward her. He walked on legs, yet there was no other description for the way he moved. The pale, black-clad shape bent toward her, and she would have shrieked when he touched a finger to her forehead. She would have shrieked if she could have summoned any sound at all. Her lungs were airless sacs. The touch burned like red-hot iron. Vaguely she wondered why she did not smell her own flesh burning. The great lord straightened, and the searing pain dwindled, vanished. Her terror did not lessen in the slightest, though. You are marked as mine, the great lord rasped. Messana will not harm you, unless I give her permission. You will find who threatens my creatures here, and deliver them to me. He turned away from her, and the dark armor fell from his body. She was startled when it hit the carpeted floor tiles with a crash of steel, rather than simply vanishing. He was clothed in black, and she could not have said whether it was silk or leather or something else. The darkness of it seemed to drink the light from the room. Messana began to thrash in her bonds, keening shrilly past the gag in her mouth. Go now, he said, if you wish to live another hour. The sound coming from Messana rose to a despairing scream. Alviarin did not know how she got out of her wounds. She could not understand how she was upright when her legs felt like water, but she found herself running through the corridors, skirts pulled to her knees, and running as hard as she could. Suddenly, the head of a wide staircase loomed in front of her, and she barely managed to stop from running right out into the air. Sagging against the wall, shaking, she stared down the curving flight of white marble steps. In her mind, she could see her body breaking as it crashed down the stairway. Breathing raggedly, in hoarse, raw-throated pants, she put a trembling hand to her forehead. Her thoughts tumbled one over another as she would have down the stairs. The great lord had marked her as his. Her fingers slid across smooth, unblemished skin. She had always prized knowledge. Power grew from knowledge. But she did not want to know what was happening in the rooms she had left. She wished she did not know that anything was happening. The great lord had marked her, but Messana would find a way to kill her for knowing that. The great lord had marked her and given her a command. She could live if she found who was hunting the black Aja. Straightening her back with an effort, she hurriedly scrubbed at the tears on her cheeks with the heels of her palms. She could not pull her eyes away from the stairs falling away in front of her. Elida surely suspected her, but if there was no more to it than that, she could always manufacture a hunt. It just had to include Elida herself as a threat to be extinguished. Delivered to the great lord. Her fingers fluttered to her forehead again. She had the black Aja at her command. Smooth, unblemished skin. Talene had been there, in Elida's room. Why had she looked at Yukiri and Doacine that way? Talene was black, though she did not know that Alviarin was, of course. Would any mark show near? Was there something that others could see? If she had to manufacture a scheme for Elida's supposed hunters, Talene might be a place to start. She tried to trace the route any message would have taken from heart to heart before it reached Talene, but she could not stop staring down the stairs, seeing her body bounce and break its way to the bottom. The great lord had marked her. Chapter 22. One answer. Pavara waited with a touch of impatience while the slim little accepted placed the rimmed silver tray on a side table and uncovered the dish of cakes. A short woman with a serious face, Pedro was not being laggard or resentful over having to spend the morning fetching and carrying for a sitter, just precise and careful. Those were useful qualities to be encouraged. Still, when the accepted asked whether she should pour the wine, Pavara said crisply, "We will do for ourselves, child. You may wait in the anteroom." She almost told the young woman to go back to her studies. Pedra spread her banded white skirts in a graceful curtsy without any sign of being flustered, the way accepted often were when a sitter showed snappishness. All too frequently, accepted took any bite in a sitter's tone as an opinion on their fitness for the shawl, as if sitters had no other concerns. Pavara waited until the door closed behind Pedra and the latch clicked before nodding approvingly. "That one will be raised eyes to die soon," she said. It was satisfying when any woman attained the shawl, but especially when the woman had appeared unpromising to begin with. Small pleasures seemed the only ones available these days. "Not one of ours, though, I think," was the reply from her surprising guest, who turned from a study of the row of painted miniatures of Pavara's dead family that stood in a line on the wave-carved marble mantel above the fireplace. "She's uncertain about men. I believe they make her nervous." Tarna certainly had never been nervous about men or very much of anything else, at least not since she reached the shawl just over 20 years ago. Pavara could remember a very jumpy novice, but the pale-haired woman's blue eyes were steady as stones now, and about as warm as stones in winter. Even so, there was something in that cool, prideful face, something in the set of her mouth that made her seem uneasy this morning. Pavara could hardly imagine what might make Tarna Fair nervous. The real question, though, was why the woman had come to see her. It bordered on impropriety for her to visit any sitter privately, particularly a Red. Tarna still maintained her rooms here in the Red Quarter, but so long as she held her new position, she was no longer part of the Red Aja, despite the crimson embroidery on her dark gray dress. Delaying the move to her new apartment might be taken as a show of delicacy by those who did not know her. Anything out of the ordinary made Pavara wary, since Siain had pulled her into hunting the Black Aja, and Elida trusted Tarna just as she had trusted Galena. It was wise to be very cautious with anyone Elida trusted. Just thinking of Galena, the light burned the woman forever, still set Pavara's teeth on edge. But there was a second connection. Galena had taken a special interest in Tarna as a novice, too. True, Galena had taken an interest in any novice or accepted she thought might join the Red, but it was another reason for caution. Not that Pavara let anything show on her face, of course. She had been eyes to die too long for that. Smiling, she reached for the long-necked silver pitcher that sat on the tray, giving off the sweet scent of spices. "Will you take wine, Tarna, in congratulation for being raised?" Silver goblets in hand, they settled on spiral-worked armchairs, a style that had gone out of fashion in Candor near 100 years ago, but one that Pavara liked. She saw no reason to change her furniture or anything else according to the whims of the moment. The chairs had served her since they were new-made, and they were comfortable with the addition of a few cushions. Tarna sat stiffly, however, on the edge of her seat. No one had ever called her languid, but clearly she was uneasy. "I am not certain congratulations are in order," she said, fingering the narrow red stole draped around her neck. The exact shade was not prescribed, except that anyone who saw it must call the color red, and she had chosen a brilliant scarlet that nearly shone. Elida insisted, and I could not refuse. Much has changed since I left the tower, inside as well as out. Alviarin made everyone watchful of the keeper. I suspect some will want her birched when she finally returns. And Elida..." She paused to sip at her wine, but when she lowered the goblet, she went on in a different vein. "I have often heard you called unconventional. I have even heard that you once said you would like to have a warder." "I've been called worse than unconventional," Pavara said dryly. What had the woman been about to say concerning Elida? She sounded as though she would have refused the keeper's stole, given her wishes. Strange. Tarna was hardly shy or shrinking. Silence seemed best, especially about warders. She had been talking too much, if that was general gossip. Besides, keep silent long enough, and the other woman always spoke, if only to fill up the gap. You could learn a great deal through silence. She sipped her own wine slowly. There was too much honey in it for her taste, and not enough ginger. Still stiff, Tarna rose and strode to the fireplace, where she stood staring at the miniatures sitting on their white lacquered stands. She raised a hand to touch one of the ivory ovals, and Pavara felt her own shoulders tighten in spite of herself. Georg, her youngest brother, had been only 12 when he died, when all of the people in those paintings died, in an uprising by dog friends. They had not been a family who could afford ivory miniatures, but once she had the coin, she found a painter who could capture her memories. A beautiful boy, Georg, tall for his years and utterly fearless. Long after the event, she had learned how her baby brother died, with a knife in his hand, standing over their father's body and trying to keep the mob from their mother. So many years ago now. They would all have been long dead in any case, and their children's children's children as well. But some hatreds never die. The dragon reborn is Taviran, so I have heard, Tarna said finally, still staring at Georg's picture. Do you think he alters chance everywhere? Or do we change the future by ourselves, one step following another until we find ourselves somewhere we never expected?
Be
What do you
right
mean?
back.
Pavara said, a trifle more curtly than she could have wished. She did not like the other woman peering at her brother's image so intensely while talking of a man who could channel, even if he was the dragon reborn. She bit her lip so as not to tell Tarna to turn around and look at her. You could not read someone's back the way you could a face. I anticipated no great difficulty in Salidar, no great success either, but what I found... Was that a shake of her head, or had she merely changed the angle at which she was peering at the miniature? She spoke slowly, but with an undercurrent of remembered urgency. I left a pigeon handler a day outside the village, yet it took me less than half a day to get back to her. And after I loosed the birds with copies of my report, I pressed on so hard I had to pay the woman off because she could not keep up. I can hardly say how many horses I went through. Sometimes the animal was spent to the point I had to show my ring to make a stable take it in trade, even with silver added. And because I pressed so hard, I happened to reach a village in Murundi while a recruiting party was there. If I had not been frightened out of my wits for the tower by what I saw in Salidar, I would have ridden to Abu Dar and taken ship for Ilion and then upriver. But the thought of going south instead of north, the thought of waiting for a vessel, sent me like an arrow toward Tarvalin. So I was in that village to see it. Who, Tarna? Ashama. The woman did turn then. Her eyes were still blue ice, but tight. She held her goblet in both hands as if trying to soak in the warmth. I did not know what they were then, of course, but they were openly recruiting men to follow the Dragon Reborn, and it seemed wisest to listen before I spoke. Well for me that I did. There were 6 of them, Pavara. 6 men in black coats. 2 with silver swords on their collars were feeling men out about whether they might like to learn to channel. Oh, they did not say so right out. Wield the lightnings, they called it. Wield the lightnings and ride the thunder. But it was clear enough to me, if not to the fools they were talking to. Yes, very well for you that you kept silent, Pavara said quietly. 6 men who can channel would be more than merely dangerous for a sister by herself. Our eyes and ears are full of talk about these recruiting parties. They appear everywhere from Saldeia to Tyr, but no one seems to have an idea of how to stop them, if it isn't too late to catch them. She very nearly bit her lip again. That was the trouble with talking. Sometimes you said more than you wanted. Oddly, the comment took some of the stiffness out of Tarna. She resumed her seat, leaning back. Though a hint of weariness still clung to the way she held herself, she chose her words carefully, pausing to touch the wine to her lips. But she did not actually drink, that Pavara saw. I had a long time to think on the river ship coming north. Longer after the fool captain ran us aground so hard he broke a mast and put a hole in the hull. Days trying to hail another ship after we got ashore, and days finding a horse. 6 of those men sent to one village convinced me, finally. Oh, the district around as well, but it was not very populous. I I believe it is too late. Elida thinks they can all be gentled, Tavara said non-committally. She had already exposed herself too much. When they can send 6 to one small village and travel, there is only one answer I can see. We Tana took a deep breath, fingering the bright red stole again, but now it seemed more in regret than to play for time. Red sisters must take them as warders, Pavara. That was so startling that Pavara blinked. A hair less self-control, and she would have gaped. Are you serious? Those icy blue eyes met her gaze steadily. The worst was past, the unthinkable spoken aloud, and Tarna was a woman of stone once more. This is hardly a matter for joking. The only other choice is to let them run loose. Who else can do it? Red sisters are used to facing men like this and ready to take the necessary risks. Anyone else will flinch. Each sister will have to take more than one, but Greens appear to manage well enough with that. I think the Greens will faint if this is suggested to them, though. We, Red sisters, must do what needs to be done. Have you broached this to Elida? Pavara asked, and Tarna shook her head impatiently. Elida believes as you said. The yellow-haired woman frowned into her wine before going on. Elida often believes what she wants to believe, and sees what she wants to see. I tried to bring up the Ashaman the first day I was back. Not to suggest bonding, not to her, I am not a fool. She forbade me to mention them to her. But you are unconventional. And do you believe they can be gentled after they're bonded? I have no idea what that would do to the sister holding the bond, and in truth, I don't want to learn. She was the one playing for time, Pavara realized. She had had no idea where this interview was headed when it began, but she would have wagered everything she owned against it coming to this. That might be the end, and it might prove impossible, the other woman replied coolly. The woman was stone. Either way, I can see no other way to handle these Ashaman. Red sisters must bond them as warders. If there is any way, I will be among the first, but it must be done. She sat there, calmly sipping her wine, and for a long time Pavara could only stare at her in consternation. Nothing Tarna had said proved she was not Black Aja, yet she could not distrust every sister unable to prove that. Well, she could, and did, when it came to matters of black, but there were other matters she had to deal with. She was a sitter, not simply a hunting dog. She had the White Tower to think of, and Aes Sedai far from the tower, and the future. Dipping her fingers into her embroidered belt pouch, she drew out a small piece of paper rolled into a thin tube. It seemed to her that it should glow with letters of fire. So far, she was one of 2 women in the tower who knew what was written there. Even once she had it out, she hesitated before handing it to Tarna. This came from one of our agents in Kyrian, but it was sent by Tovain Gazar. Tarna's eyes jerked to Bavara's face at the mention of Tovain's name, then fell to reading again. Her stony face did not change even after she finished, and let the paper roll back into a tube in her hand. This changes nothing, she said flatly, coldly. It only makes what I suggest more urgent. On the contrary, Pavara sighed. That changes everything. It changes the whole world. Chapter 23. Ornaments. The air in the room was just sufficiently warmer than outside to put a mist on the glass panes set in the red-painted casements, and the glass contained bubbles besides. But Katswain stood peering out as if she could see the dreary landscape clearly. She could see with more than enough clarity in any case. A few hapless folk, bundled and hatted, and only shapeless skirts or baggy breeches distinguishing men from women, were trudging the muddy fields that surrounded the manor house, sometimes stooping to feel a handful of the soil. It would not be long before they could begin their plowing and manuring, but only their inspection indicated the coming of spring any time soon. Beyond the fields, the forest was all dark, bare branches against a washed-out gray morning sky. A good coating of snow would have made the view much less bleak, but it snowed lightly and seldom here, with traces of one fall rarely lasting until the next. Still, she could think of few places better for her purposes, with the spine of the world little more than a day's hard ride to the east. Who would think to look inside the borders of Tyr? Had convincing the boy to stay here been too easy, though? With a sigh, she turned from the window, feeling the golden ornaments hanging in her hair sway, the small moons and stars, birds and fish. She was very aware of them of late. Aware? Faugh! Of late she had considered sleeping with them in place. The sitting room was large, but not ornate, like the manor house itself, with cornices of carved wood painted red. The furniture was bright with paint, but not a touch of gilding. The two long fireplaces, plain stone, if well made, the andirons sturdy wrought metal made for long service rather than appearances. The fires on the hearths were small, at her insistence, the flames flickering low on half-consumed splits. But either was enough to warm her hands, which was all she wanted. Left to his own devices, Algarin would have surrounded her with blazing warmth and smothered her in servants, few as he still employed. A lesser lord of the land, he was far from wealthy, yet he paid his debts in letter and spirit, even when most other men would have seen quite the reverse of a debt. The uncarved door to the hall creaked open. Most of Algarin's servants were nearly as old as he, and though they kept everything dusted and neat, the lamps topped with oil and the wicks trimmed, hinges in the manor seemed to escape regular oiling. The door creaked open to admit Varen, still dressed for a journey in simple brown wool with divided skirts, and carrying her cloak over her arm, still patting her gray-streaked hair into place. The stout little sister's square face wore a vexed expression, and she was shaking her head. Well, the sea folk are delivered to Tyr, Katswain. I didn't go near the stone, but I heard that High Lord Astoril stopped complaining about his creaking joints and mustered inside with Darlin. Who'd have thought Astoril would stir himself and on Darlin's side? The streets are full of armsmen, most getting drunk and picking fights with each other when they're not fighting à Anier. There are as many sea folk in the city as everyone else put together. Harina was aghast. She went rushing out to the ships as soon as she could hire a boat, expecting to be declared mistress of the ships and set everything to rights. There seems no doubt that Nesta Dinrius is dead. Katswain was content to let the round little woman chatter on. Varen was not nearly so vague as she pretended. Some Browns really were capable of tripping over their own feet from not noticing them, but Varen was one of those who wore an assumed cloak of unworldliness. She seemed to believe that Katswain accepted the cloak for reality, yet if there was a point to be made, she would make it. And what she left out might be revealing, too. Katswain was less sure of the other sister than she might have wished. Uncertainty was a fact of life, but she was uncertain about entirely too many things to suit her. Unfortunately, Min must have been listening at the door, and that young woman had little patience. I told Harina it wouldn't be like that, she protested, bursting into the room. I told her she'd be punished for the bargain she made with Rand. Only after that will she become mistress of the ships, and I can't say if it will be 10 days from now or 10 years. Slim and pretty and tall in her red-heeled boots, with dark ringlets hanging to her shoulders, Min had a low, womanly voice, but she wore a boy's red coat and blue breeches. The coat was embroidered with colorful flowers on the lapels and up the sleeves, and the breeches in bands down the outsides of the legs, but they were still coat and breeches. You may come in, Min, Cadsuane said quietly. It was a tone that usually made people sit up and take notice, those who knew her at all, anyway. Spots of color appeared in Min's cheeks. The Wave Mistress has already learned all she is going to from your viewing, I fear. But from your urgency, perhaps you've read someone else's auras and wish to tell me what you saw? The girl's peculiar ability had proved helpful in the past, and doubtless could again. Perhaps. As far as Cadsuane could tell, she did not lie about what she saw in the images and auras that she perceived floating around people, but it was not always forthcoming either. Particularly not when it came to the one person Cadsuane would have liked to know about above all others. Red cheeks or no red cheeks, Min raised her chin stubbornly. She had changed since Shadar Logoth, or perhaps it had begun earlier, but either way the change was not for the better. Rand wants you to come see him. He said to ask, so you needn't get snippy over it. Cadsuane merely looked at her and let the silence stretch. Snippy? Definitely not for the better. Tell him I will come when I am able, she said finally. Close the door firmly behind you, Min. The young woman opened her mouth as if to say something more, but at least she retained sense enough to leave it unsaid. She even made a passable curtsy, in spite of those ridiculous boots, and shut the door firmly behind her, just barely short of slamming it, in fact. Varen shook her head again, giving a laugh that sounded only slightly amused. She's in love with the young man, Cadsuane, and she's tucked her heart in his pocket. She'll follow that before her head, whatever you say or do. I think she's afraid he almost died on her, and you know how that can make a woman determined to hang on. Cadsuane's lips thinned. Varen knew more about that sort of relations with men than she did. She had never believed in indulging with her own warders, as some Greens did, and other men had always been out of the question. But the Brown had hit close to a truth without knowing. At least, Cadsuane did not think the other sister knew Min was bonded to the Althor boy. She herself only knew because the girl had let too much slip in a careless moment. Even the tightest muscle eventually yielded its meat once you got that first small crack in the shell. Sometimes it gave up an unexpected pearl as well. Yes, Min would want to keep the lad alive whether she loved him or not, but no more than Cadsuane did. Draping her cloak on the tall back of a chair, Varen moved to the nearest fireplace and stretched out her hands to warm them in front of the low flames. You could not say that Varen glided, but she was more graceful than her bulk suggested. How much of her...
All right, everyone. I'm going to call it into this life for tonight. I want to thank everyone for stopping by. Everyone keep stopping by. I appreciate all y'all support. Till next time, everyone. Y'all stay safe.